Hi, everyone. Today we're going to talk about population dynamics or how populations change over time. So we're going to have a little review. What is a population? Hopefully you're thinking that a population is a group of individuals of the same species living in an area. And the boundary around that area is important to define. If you wanted to know the number of people living in America, for example, you want to send census papers to those households addressed in America, not to people living in Mexico, in Canada, Europe, anywhere else in the world, just households in the boundary of America. So again, boundary, very important to define. The hierarchy of ecology will start at the organism level. Remember, in this class, we started at the bottom of our hierarchy with atoms and how those atoms could be built into molecules, organelles, cells, tissues, organs, organ systems, and organisms. And that brings us to our ecology unit. So we would start with organisms building into populations, into communities, ecosystems, and the biosphere. So far, we have talked about several things that can cause a population to change. The number of predators in an ecosystem can definitely make an impact on population. Disease in that ecosystem, the amount of available resources, the number of mates. There's others I'm sure that you can think of as well, um, but those are a few just to help guide you on your way of thinking on how populations can change and what factors will determine those changes. So remember talking about food chains a long time ago. Over here to the right, you've got a deer, a mountain lion, and some grass. And I want you to try to make a food chain or food pyramid out of these organisms. So hopefully you came up with something like this. You've got your grass at the bottom, the lion in the top, the deer in the middle. So remember that this is a population pyramid, and the size of the box represents how much available energy or biomass is in that particular level. So the grass has the most available energy to be passed up this food chain. Um, Now, how would each level be affected if a new predator moved in? And we can assume that this predator is going to eat the deer. So that will drive the deer population down. And since there's less things to eat this grass, we would expect to see more grass, more vegetation. However, this new predator is going to be competing with this mountain lion. So there will be less food to support this mountain lion population, and that will drive this population down. So go down, goes up. On your final exam, you might have some questions related to this hierarchy of life. So the smallest level of the hierarchy are the atoms. And atoms come together to make molecules, which come together to make organelles, and so on and so forth until we get down here at the largest level, which is the biosphere. And the biosphere is going to cover all of the living things on the planet. Now, on your exam, you might have some questions about this hierarchy, like what level would fall between the community and biospheres levels. And hopefully you would answer ecosystems. An ecosystem includes a couple of different components. The biotic factors, bio means life, so these are the living things, and abiotic factors, which are non-living things. There are many different kinds of ecosystems, and I'm sure you've been familiar with these since you were kids. Tropical rainforest, tundra, desert, chaparral, grasslands, marine ecosystems like coral reefs, and the list goes on and on. All of your different biomes would be your ecosystems. And they're made of different communities, which are populations that are living together. So if we look at this ecosystem, this is a coral reef. This picture was taken off Biscayne, Florida. Um, so we see here a population of fish and another population of fish. There's some different populations of corals, and there's different kinds of those corals. So all of these communities come together to make up the biotic factors of this ecosystem. Some of the abiotic factors in this picture would include the water, the salt in the water, the pH, the light, the temperature, all of these non-living components. Organisms in a population will spread themselves out in different ways, and there are three kinds of population distributions: clumped, even or uniform, and random. Random is most common. We definitely see it with plants where we have the random sprinkling of seeds. Clumped is common in animals, like these fish, for example. You have schools of fish clumped together. There are some examples of solitary animals like moose that might not have a clumped formation. Even or uniform is more rare. We see that with things we've planted, like white pine forests, and with a few natural populations like penguins. They'll make their nests pretty even distances apart. However, I want you to think about this. If I'm looking at a nesting ground of penguins, on an ice shelf and I zoom out, then I'm going to have spaces where I've got penguins and empty spaces where I don't. And so if I zoom out far enough, I might have clumped distributions. That would be even if I zoomed in. So the distance that you are looking at these population distributions can make a big difference. Populations change over time. They fluctuate around an average as resource availability changes. So if I want to calculate my population size, I'm going to have my new population number equal to my original population plus the number of individuals that were born and the number of individuals that moved into an area. I stands for immigration, I for into. We're going to take away the number of individuals that died and the number of individuals that emigrated. They exited the area. E for exit. They left. So this is going to tell you your population change in a particular location. And populations will grow over time and decline. So we have two general types of growth, exponential and logarithmic. Exponential growth occurs when populations have no limitations, as in there's so many resources that the population can grow and grow and grow without stopping. So this is going to result in a J-shaped curve. Use your imagination. There's the J-shape. When you graph the number of individuals in that population on the y-axis against increasing time on the x-axis. So this is the human population. You can see that for the first 10,000 years or so of human existence, there were less than a billion people on our planet. Currently, there's about 7.7 billion people, and by 2050, it's estimated there will be 9 billion people. So humans are really good at engineering their ecosystem to take away these limitations so that we can grow more food to support us and things like that. Now notice that the population did not start to explode until about 200 years ago during the Industrial Revolution, when we started using fossil fuels to grow more food, developing tractors and using those to grow food instead of horses and plows. That greatly increased the production of food and allowed us to have a higher number of people on the planet. But exponential growth cannot continue forever. Eventually you're going to run out of resources and the population will stop growing. These resources that set how big a population can get are called limiting factors, and they can be biotic or abiotic, that is living or non-living. So here's a little example to help you understand limiting factors. If I'm trying to build little houses like this, I need bases and roofs. So if these are my materials, how many of these little houses can I build? Hopefully you're thinking 4, because there are 4 bases, even though there are 6 roofs. These bases are my limiting factor. They are present in the least amount, and they will determine how many total houses I can build. So the limiting factor is what's present in the least amount, and it will set how big the population can get. These factors that are density dependent depend on the size of the population. They'll run out faster if populations are higher. They're usually living things, like food, for example. I have a certain amount of food in an area. If I have fewer organisms, they're going to go through that food slower than if I have a whole bunch of organisms. So the food is density dependent. The more organisms, the faster it goes away. Disease is density dependent, like these coronaviruses. And we've heard social distancing because viruses spread faster when populations are dense, when their individuals are closer together. So disease, even viruses, though they are non-living, are density dependent because they depend on the size of the population as to how fast they will spread. Other factors are density independent, and these are usually non-living or abiotic things. And most of the time we think about these as far as natural disasters. Could also be the amount of sunlight coming through a canopy, for example. But these are going to control the population regardless of its current size. So if a hurricane were to come through, it's going to destroy some individuals of that population, regardless of how big it is. The size of the population doesn't really have any effect on whether or not that hurricane is a big hurricane or a little hurricane. So those are density independent, and they will influence your carrying capacity and growth. So carrying capacity is the number of organisms that an ecosystem can support. Now, we talked about exponential growth, where populations keep on going and they have no limiting factors, so they can grow and grow and grow. Logistic growth is the opposite of this. This is when you do have limiting factors and it will set a carrying capacity on the ecosystem. So we have an S-shaped curve when you graph your population size on the y-axis and your time on the x-axis, instead of a J-shaped curve. So this indicates where your carrying capacity is, where this flat line of the graph is. And if I want to know how many individuals this ecosystem can support, I would follow this flat area of the graph over to the y-axis to my population size, I say around 95. If I want to know when this population reached its carrying capacity, I would find where this line started to get flat, say around here, and trace that down and around year 31 or so. So carrying capacity indicates a stable ecosystem. You're getting that population to cycle according to how many resources are there. And carrying capacity can change. I might have a certain carrying capacity for deer on an island, but one year I get a lot of rain and more vegetation grows, so I can increase the carrying capacity on that island for that amount of time. So carrying capacity will eventually be reached in all populations, even humans, at some point when we are running out of resources. Determining carrying capacity is really important if we want to preserve a particular species. And carrying capacity can change if the environment changes. Deforestation, for example, can change carrying capacity because you're eliminating habitat. So when we want to preserve an ecosystem, we want to maintain a population, we have to look at certain factors that will determine the carrying capacity of the population we want to control. The number of organisms living in that area is important to understand, and their available resources, so you can make sure your number of organisms does not outweigh the number of resources they have available. And we would also want to know the size of the ecosystem and the territory that these animals need to roam. Wild tigers in India, for example, are endangered. There's about 30,000 wild tigers left in the world. So the government in India has set aside wild preserved lands for the tigers. And what we've learned is that they're not big enough for these tigers to wander around in and have enough territory. So connecting corridors have been left between these maintained areas so that the tigers can wander back and forth and still be protected in forested lands, versus trying to go over open and developed areas that humans have used for urban areas or agricultural areas and things like that. Rainforests are going to have a higher carrying capacity than somewhere like a desert. And why would that be? Well, rainforests have more water, and so there's more chance that plants can grow there. Your amount of precipitation and the temperature in an area will determine your vegetation, which will then determine the types of animals that you can have living in that area. Large areas of land have higher carrying capacities than small areas of land. There's more resources, more territory, so higher carrying capacities. Populations cycle, so they will increase and decrease as resource availability changes. Once the population gets high, it's going to be taking out resources faster, and eventually there won't be enough resources to maintain a population that's this high, and it will crash. And then there will be a chance for those resources to come back, and the population can increase, decrease, and you get these cycles. So these are regulated based on external factors, those limiting factors that we talked about earlier. When you see the word rate, I want you to think about speed. So a birth rate is the number of individuals that are born in a year for every 1,000 individuals in that population. And death rate is the same thing, but it's how many people die in a year per 1,000 people. Both of these are usually going to be higher in developing nations, third world nations, because of the lack of medical care, the lack of access to clean water and clean food. So that's going to increase your death rate. And the lack of access to birth control will help increase your birth rate. And birth rates also tend to rise when there is a need in society for work to be fulfilled. But a big thing to remember here is that populations that cannot adapt to changing environments are going to decline and possibly go extinct. For example, polar bears that need to swim to ice, as the ice gets further and further apart with our warming planet, those polar bears that can't make it all the way out to where the ice is to hunt are probably going to die off. If we want to know if a population is increasing or decreasing, we may want to create an age class or an age structure diagram. So this is going to break the population down into certain age ranges. So here we have 0 to 4, 5 to 9, 10 to 14. On this side, we map the females. On this side, we map the males. So here you have the number of females that are 0 to 4 years old in the United States in 2018. Here you have the number of males that were 0 to 4 in the United States in 2018. Now, if I want to know if a population is increasing, decreasing, or staying the same, these can be very useful. If I have a lot of people in this age structure diagram that are young, that means there's a lot of people yet to come to reproductive age. There are very few people here getting around 60 to 70 years old, which is where life expectancy is. That means you have very few people reaching the age where they're going to die, lots of people reaching the age where they're going to reproduce. So when you have this pyramid-like shape, you have an increasing population. Do keep in mind that over 70, you're always going to have this little tapering off because not many people live to be 80 to 100 years old. If we look down here, you will see that you don't have a big difference here. There's pretty much the same number of people who are young as we have at the end of the life expectancy. So when you have these columns that are pretty straight, you have a population that's staying the same. If you wanted a population that was decreasing, you would have an inverted pyramid. Very few young people and lots of people reaching the age of life expectancy. Again, you would still have a tapering off at the top, so it's kind of like a diamond shape. You would see an age structure diagram like that from Japan. They have lots of older folks and very few young people in that demographic. We divide organisms into two different groups based on how they reproduce. There's K selection and there's R selection. And K does not mean kangaroo, but I do want you to think about kangaroos because they fit these characteristics, as most mammals will. For R, I want you to think about roaches because they fit these characteristics, as most insects will. So K selection has very few babies born to an individual. A mother kangaroo is going to have one, maybe two joeys. High amount of parental care. She's going to take care of that joey till it's about 2 years old. They're going to mature very slowly, again, about 2 years. Long gestation period or a long period of pregnancy and then a long lifespan. Not just days to weeks, but several years these organisms are going to live. R selection is the opposite of this. You have lots of babies born to an individual, sometimes hundreds, if not thousands, with insects. Little to no parental care. These roaches are going to hatch and they're going to be able to run around and do roach things immediately, pretty much. They're going to mature very quickly. As soon as they hatch, they're ready to go within a few hours. Short gestation period, roaches can reproduce very quickly, and a short lifespan, shorter if I see them. So roaches don't live very long once they mature. You can have an intermediate form of selection that's kind of between these two. Most of the time you're going to have amphibians like frogs and salamanders fall into R selection. Mammals will fall into K selection. Most plants will be R. And then for intermediate, you would have things like songbirds, squirrels, some mammals like dogs, cats that have litters of babies. So these survivorship curves come in 3 types. Type 1, notice you have 1,000 individuals that were born. They live a long time. Very few of them die until they get old. So this would be your K selection, usually. The green line here, we see there were a lot of individuals born, but they died off really quickly. They had a very short lifespan. Very few of them live to old age. And that would be your R selection. So lots of, like I said, lots of plants fall in that category. And then intermediate, you start out with a high number of individuals and you steadily lose them over the course of their life. So you have an equal chance of growing old as you do dying early for intermediate selection. And again, songbirds, squirrels, things like that. Predator and prey populations will cycle with each other fairly predictably. And so this is one of the key components of a stable ecosystem because of that predictability. Remember, the predator is the one that's doing the hunting. The prey is the one that's being hunted. On your final, you may be given a graph like this and asked to determine which line is the predator and which line is the prey. So the key thing to remember is that food availability will help determine how many organisms you can have. So you have to have more food, more prey, before you can have more predators. So if we look at this graph, the wolves are marked in blue, and on this axis, the moose are marked in yellow and are mapped on this axis. So notice you'll always have more moose than you will wolves. Notice that my moose population increases and my wolf population increases shortly after. When my wolf population gets really high, it's hunting down a lot of these moose, so the moose population will fall. Shortly after that, there's not enough moose to support the wolves, and so this population will collapse as well. So the prey will change before the predator. And keep in mind, there is a lag here because these predators need time to reproduce, okay? So again, you have in words these population cycles here. This is a graph based on the wolf and moose population on Isle Royale. It's a national park in Lake Superior off the coast of Michigan. It's been mapped pretty heavily over time. It's been studied in detail. And these are some of the big things happening in the timeline of this wolf and moose population. In the 50s, the wolves basically disappeared. The moose were very overpopulated. They killed off all the vegetation on the island, and the moose population got very unhealthy, and they started to starve. So scientists decided to bring the wolves back in the late 50s, early 60s to help maintain this moose population and keep it healthy, to avoid having so many members starve to death. We talked about competition when we talked about symbiosis. So this is when organisms fight or race for resources. There's two kinds of competition: intraspecific, which is within a species, or interspecific, which is between two different species. So both of these organisms are competing for light. So that's a resource they would both need and be competing for. So organisms that are different species will fight over the same resources a lot of times. However, there are things that organisms within a species that will compete for that organisms of a different species will not. For example, mating rights. These two gazelle might be fighting over the same doe. This gazelle is not going to fight a zebra for a female zebra. So that's just an example of something competed for with intraspecific that you won't have with inter. When you look at competition graphs, you'll always look at how these organisms grow alone versus how they're grown together. So here we have two species of Paramecium, Aurelia and Caudatum. They grow just fine when they're alone. So that tells us that the Aurelia doesn't need to eat the Caudatum or vice versa, because they're not in the same petri dish at this point and they're growing just fine. However, when we mix them together, the Aurelia population will get really high. The Caudatum population will drop to virtual extinction. So this tells us that they're going after the same food source, that the Aurelia is a better competitor and the Caudatum is not winning out here. So it's going to go extinct in this particular petri dish. Here we have another example where organisms are grown together, and these are two species of Paramecium, Caudatum and Berseria. When they are grown together, notice that neither population reaches the numbers that it reached before. So this is when we have resource partitioning. They're dividing up their resources. The Caudatum might need something from one nutrient from this petri dish that the Berseria doesn't, and the Berseria might need something that the Caudatum doesn't. So they can't get to such high numbers because there's only so much space, but they can divide those resources up. Keep in mind, competitive exclusion tells us two organisms cannot live in the same place and share the same exact niche and need the same resources without competing for them. There are many organisms that can manipulate or change their environment, but no species does this like humans. Humans are incredible ecosystem engineers. We can cut down mountains and use them as pavement. We can flood valleys and use them as hydroelectric dams or water conservation areas. We can drain swamps and have new land to build residential and commercial buildings. So we have a profound impact on our environment that is not always beneficial for other organisms. And one of the main ways we impact our environment is through pollution. The more our population grows, the more energy we need. And our primary energy source right now is by burning fossil fuels. We burn them for our electricity, our transportation, to grow our food. So lots of fossil fuel burning. And when we burn fossil fuels, we release CO2 into the atmosphere, which is a greenhouse gas. So greenhouse gases build up in the atmosphere and they trap heat coming in from the sun so that it doesn't get reflected back out into space. And that causes our planet to warm up. And we get the greenhouse effect. The more greenhouse gases, the thicker that blanket is going to be and the warmer our planet is going to stay, just like you put on a thicker blanket at night when you get cold. So when we think about carbon dioxide and temperature, we can look at data over the past 400,000 years and see that carbon dioxide, which has been mapped here in blue, sticks pretty closely with temperature that's been mapped here in red. So notice temperature's mapped over here on this axis, carbon dioxide's mapped over here, and the lines fall right on top of one another. Well, how might we know how much carbon dioxide was in the world, in the atmosphere, 400,000 years ago when there weren't people around to measure that? And even if there were, they didn't have the technology they do today. Well, we can drill down into ice cores, and when it snows, the ice is going to trap little air pockets, and the air pockets that are trapped there will have the same particles that they had when they were trapped. So we can look at little air pockets that were trapped 400,000 years ago and figure out how much CO2 there was. We can also look at fossil evidence and determine the types of plants that lived in an area so we can see what the temperature was at the time. Because plants haven't changed a whole lot in the past 400,000 years as to where they can grow and how they can grow. So we have a pretty good idea of what temperatures certain plants would need, and what temperatures their ancestors would need would be pretty close to that. So we have a good idea of carbon dioxide levels and temperature over time. So we are now in the 6th mass extinction. There have been 5. This new one is called the Anthropocene, anthropo for people, human, because humans have had such a profound impact on their environment. And these pollution levels are causing mass extinctions. We lose several organisms every day on this planet. And now on this graph, you can see it only goes up to 290, we'll say 300 parts per million. We're currently over 460. So you can imagine how much higher this red line is going to go. When a population gets very low, the chances of it going extinct become high. So effective population size is the number of individuals that are capable of reproducing in a particular area. And when an organism dies before it reproduces, it's taken its genetic information with it. So you lose genes in that population. They're not there anymore. And this reduction in genetic diversity can lead to this extinction vortex, where you lose these beneficial alleles that help an organism's population to survive change, and then the whole population becomes less healthy. We talked about tigers earlier and how India has preserved those corridors for tigers to meander between. That's gone a long way to helping the tigers maintain their genetic diversity. And even though their population is very low, it's still fairly healthy. Low populations are subject to genetic drift. This is when populations, genes are lost by chance. For example, this tiger here might be one of the last few tigers, and a tree could fall on it and it die and it not get a chance to reproduce. So those genes were lost randomly. It wasn't because they were bad genes that didn't help it survive. It's just by chance, a freak occurrence that's what happened. The lower the population, the more chance plays a role in how those genes are passed on. Inbreeding will also cause you to have more homozygous traits. And remember, with homozygosity, you only have one type of trait to pass on. So that's going to reduce the genetic diversity, especially if you wind up with a bunch of homozygous individuals with poor alleles that do not help them in that particular environment. If you ever study anything about forestry, you will need to know something about ecological succession. This is how an ecosystem changes over time, particularly in how the plant populations and communities change over time. So notice that there's 2 types. We have primary and we have secondary. They're similar in how they progress. So we start out with these pioneer species, these very small species. We move to intermediate species and then a climax community. The only difference here is that primary succession is going to start on bare rock, like a volcanic eruption or a rock exposed from a retreating glacier, whereas secondary succession is going to start on cleared soil, like a forest fire that burns down all the vegetation, or a farmer that plows a field and never plants it back. So that would be examples of secondary succession. We also have pond succession. We'll look at it here in just a few minutes. The climax community is the mature community of trees. It's not going to do a whole lot of changing from there. It's pretty stable. So looking at this a little bit closer, again, primary succession's on bare rock. Secondary succession, you do have soil. So notice that with the primary succession, you've got a few extra steps. You have to have your lichens, your mosses, small things that can live on this bare rock. As they die, they're going to decay and you'll increase your soil depth. So that has to happen before you can have these larger plants like grasses that take root. Keep in mind, these plants, the seeds are going to come from the surrounding area. There's not just going to be new things that pop up. These seeds will just have to spread in from nearby locations. Secondary succession's a little bit quicker. Either way, you're going to be reaching that climax community in about 150 years. So people that are interested in forestry, you can use this succession pattern to predict how old a forest is. Pond succession, notice, has no time frame on it. Ponds are different sizes and different depths. So depending on how deep the pond is, this could take a long time or it could be pretty quick. Still, we have plants that are going to move in, decay, and you'll increase the depth of your soil in the bottom of that pond until eventually there's hardly any pond left. It's finally gone, and then you get your climax community. And again, no time frame, because the size and the depth of the ponds are all going to be different. The location could also play a role in how quick this happens, depending on how fast you get these plants growing and decaying. And that's it for population dynamics. Go ahead and try your quiz on this. We're almost done with this semester. So hopefully you learned a little bit today about populations, human impact, all that good stuff. If you have any questions, please let me know.